Hi, Nat Doig here. After 2 weird wanders away from the Wade, we are back in Biggleswade today. I have a ghost story for you that stretches over a century. This story also links to Biggleswade's mysterious tunnels, which we will begin to explore. Just a heads up that there is a brief mention of suicide in this episode. So please do choose carefully where and when you listen. Hello and welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful and a little off kilter in the town of Biggleswade in Bedfordshire. Each episode, I'll tell you a tale of something strange and unique that has happened in this most English of market towns or its surrounding area. There's an older meaning to the word weird, which means to twist and turn. In Norse myth and in Anglo-Saxon times, this came to mean fate or destiny, all that was and is and all that is yet to be. Whether it's tales of ghosts or flying saucer hoaxes, the big cat of Biggleswade, or the pot and poisoner, curious social history, or the Great Swan Mystery of 1935, we'll follow all the twists and turns and uncover fascinating stories that will speak to you today, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. It's October 1881. 2 girls are standing beneath the chestnut trees, peering into the darkness of the garden between Crab Lane and Cemetery Street. It's where Chestnut Avenue and the library stand today in Biggleswade. Cemetery Street is now the bulk. It's early evening and already dark. A faint glow from the street lamp at the top of London Road filters through the large ochre horse chestnut leaves. One of the girls is 12-year-old Louisa Green, a maid at Camden House School. Her companion is a pupil of the school, a boarder called Kate de Messi Kay. Kate is 13 and almost half a foot taller than Louisa. Neither of them should be away from the school, and certainly not loitering in a dark garden.
What if they're back early and one of the Lockwoods catches us, Kate?
Louisa asks.
They won't. And if they do, we'll say you dropped something here earlier today whilst running errands. Why does it have to be me? You could easily have left a music book here this afternoon.
Because I am older than you and less likely to be careless. Anyway, I will say that I sent you to buy sugar mice for me and you dropped them, and that is why we're under the trees looking. Then we'll both be in trouble. Fair? Louisa nods. Kate is the only girl at the school, boarder or day girl, who pays any attention to her. Otherwise, Louisa might as well be invisible. But Kate is different. She likes to sneak down to the kitchen at night and beg a warm drink from cook, then sit by the fire whilst Priscilla tells them ghost tales. And that was precisely what had got them into this predicament. Priscilla, the housemaid, and her stories. Priscilla was strict, bossing Louisa about all day until evening came. Then she'd sit in the kitchen with cook sipping from a pewter flask and tell stories. She had told them both of a ghost or will-o'-the-wisp that haunted the Crab Lane gardens. It was seen as a glowing white light or mist which hovered on a path below the trees in the garden. It had terrified a couple of gardeners over the summer, and more recently, a lad on his way home from the Hopbine pub said he'd seen a white figure flitting through the trees, though most said he was worse for drink at the time. Now the nights were growing long and dark, The residents of Cemetery Street were afraid to walk past the gardens. The children going to and from school along Crab Lane were also scared. The temptation for conkers was becoming too much, though. During the daylight hours, children would scurry beneath the trees collecting the shining nuts. But, come dark, none dared stray into the garden or walk near its boundary. None except for Louisa and Kate. Louisa was fascinated by the stories. She asked Priscilla why so many assumed the apparition was bad. Could it not be a fairy or an angel? Priscilla said she did not see why it shouldn't be one of the fae folk. Cook snorted at this. Such talk was beneath her. Kate, however, stated that we need to study it. Rather than being terrified little mice like those gardeners and that drunken lad, we should observe it, record its details and apply a proper scientific method to it. Listen to her, Cook exclaimed. A proper Charles Darwin. You'll never get a husband talking like that, girl. But Louisa just looked at Kate with nothing but admiration as Kate brushed an unruly strand of auburn hair from her forehead, ignoring Cook's outburst. Louisa, Kate said, tomorrow evening we shall go and see if this apparition emerges, and we shall study it. No, you shan't, Priscilla had interjected. Why not, Priscilla? It's Sunday evening. Both Louisa and I are free from obligations. You would not deny us this educational endeavour, would you? Think of the stories you'd be able to tell if we come back to you with evidence of the spirit's existence. And so Cook and Priscilla had turned a blind eye to the girls' plans. Cook was away visiting her brother anyway that Sunday, and Priscilla was already sipping away at her pewter flask by the time the girls had snuck out. And that is why Kate and Louisa are standing beneath the chestnut trees, staring into the much darker interior of the gardens. How long should we wait? Louisa asks. Until we hear the clock strike the hour. Then we'll have to leave. So do be patient. Louisa doesn't expect to see anything. She believes in the Crab Lane spectre, as many are now calling it, but it won't appear whilst you're looking for it, surely. That's not how these things work. Time is dragging its heels. The fallen leaves at their feet swirl in an eddy of cold breeze and then settle again. Louisa shivers. An owl calls, startling them both for a moment. Then more waiting. Holding her breath, Louisa's mind begins to wander to the tasks awaiting her before bed. Then, Kate grabs her arm and hisses, "Look there!" Louisa isn't sure where there is. She looks at Kate's face, dark and indistinct, then looks back into the blacker garden. "I don't see anything," she complains. "Just ahead, and to the right," Kate whispers. Louisa stares and stares, and then she thinks she sees a slight shimmer amongst the darkness, like a reflection of water, but there is no water in the garden. There is no light. The shimmer becomes brighter, fuller, like a sparkling oval, twisting and turning in the darkness. It's beneath the rowan tree, she thinks. So it can't be bad, can it? Rowans protect you from evil and from witches, or so her grandmother always said. "What is it?" Louisa asks. "I don't know," Kate admits, reaching for Louisa's hand. Kate's hand is gloved, but Louisa can feel it trembling. "But I must observe and lay down to memory what I see. You too, Louisa. You shall draw it after, so pay close attention." Both girls watch and observe as the oval of white and pearlescent light shimmers through the darkness. Sometimes it seems to swell in size, then shrink back down again. Sometimes it floats gently to the left, then it slips back to its original position. It is utterly mesmerising. "Could it be one of those new electrical lights?" Louisa whispers. "I don't think so." The shimmering swells again, becoming a mist of many tiny sparkling points of light until suddenly it shrinks, flits right in a zigzag through the grass bank that borders the garden, and it is gone. The girls wait, watching, wondering if it will come back. The tension in their bones loosens. Kate lets go of Louisa's hand in what feels like a rush. Rightio, I think it's gone. Let's get back and write up, or in your case, draw what we witnessed. Suddenly, all action again. Kate is marching away to the gate, her boots crunching through the green, spiky shells of conkers and fallen leaves. Louisa tags along behind, remembering that her friend's hand had been trembling, and this confident, strident girl ahead of her had in fact been scared. Both girls rush into the kitchen, out of breath, to find Priscilla working over the stove in Cook's absence. You're cutting it fine. The Lockwoods are due back any minute. Her face softens. Did you see anything?
Oh, yes.
Both girls exclaim in unison. After supper, Kate retires to write up her scientific observations of the Crab Lane anomalous light, as she is calling it. Louisa is preparing for the following day's work. Monday is wash day. She is sorting through the laundry when Priscilla arrives at her side. You really saw something then? She asks, joining Louisa in her task.
Yeah, we did. It was a sparkling, rippling light of some kind. Most peculiar. I thought it might be one of those new electric lights, but Kate said no.
Well, never. I believe you, girl. I believe that you have a rare gift, Louisa Green. You are what we might call sensitive. What do you believe it was that you saw, girl?
A fairy or an angel, maybe. It was not frightening. It was beautiful.
Priscilla is silent for a while. Her brow furrows. I do believe you, girl. You have a gift for such things, for seeing the things which are hidden, but they are not all light and pretty, like the Crab Lane spirit. Do you understand what I'm saying? Some are dark, not to be trifled with, yeah?
I think I know what you mean.
Good, because that Kate de Kay, she'll drag you to the ends of the earth in pursuit of that scientific nonsense. She don't understand what she's meddling with, nor does she understand that she can't remain friends with you for much longer. You inhabit different spheres. She'll have to give up this science nonsense, just as she'll have to give up you one day, girl. She's not as well-to-do as some, but she is in a different sphere to the likes of us. Do you understand that? Louisa lowers her head, staring at her hands, their red knuckles. But I'm currently more vexed about her pursuit of science and spirits. I hope you'd see nothing in Crab Lane Gardens and she'd get bored and find a new pursuit. But she's more fired up than ever, like a terrier after a rat, that girl is. So I want you to promise me, Louisa Green, that you will not tell her about that tunnel entrance in the basement. Do you promise? Louisa pauses. In her sorting of the dirty clothes, she's not thinking about the tunnel nor the basement. She is thinking on Priscilla's words about her and Kate inhabiting different spheres. She bites her lip. Do you hear me, girl?
Yes. Why would I tell her about that anyway? It's just an old cellar tunnel.
It's not just an old cellar tunnel, girl. It's a dangerous and haunted place. You must not approach it, nor tell anyone else for it. Do you understand, girl? Louisa nods. Now head off to bed. I'll finish up here. Louisa slinks off to bed, pondering Priscilla's strange behaviour. Priscilla being thoughtful and generous is more frightening than when she bullies and bosses, but Louisa's curiosity is now piqued. She had not thought to tell Kate about the basement tunnel, but now she'll do anything to keep them both in the same sphere for a little bit longer. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. Today we will be exploring ghost stories stretching over 2 centuries, which are linked to the site of the old Camden House School, which is the most easterly extent of the Biggleswade tunnels that we know of. Yes, we have a Victorian ghost story, but also ones dating from the 1950s and 60s. The place was eventually so notorious that the local newspaper referred to a business based in Camden House as the Ghost Shop in 1970. This is the first part in an exploration of Biggleswade's tunnels. Next time I'll be telling a ghost story linked with the tunnel's most westerly point. As always, I am keen to hear from anyone who has any information about the tunnels or Camden House School. Please email me at weirdinthewade weirdinthewade@gmail.com, or find Weird in the Wade on social media. In the show description where you're listening currently, there are links. But before we return to 1880s Biggleswade, I just wanted to thank everyone who attended the 1-year anniversary live stream. It was so lovely to see so many of you there. If you missed it, you can still catch it on YouTube. And again, there's a link in the show description. On the live stream, I talked about my night in the Chamber of Trembling Madness in York, as well as answering questions. So do check it out if you missed it. I also wanted to let you know that Weird in the Wade now has a Patreon, so if you're able to and you want to support the show regularly with a regular donation, you'll receive bonus content through the Patreon. The first bonus Patreon episode went live in mid-May and was all about the Treasurer's House in York and the many hauntings associated with it. I even shared my own spooky encounter at the house in that bonus episode. I've also made that episode available to anyone who has or does in the future support the show through Ko-fi. This means that if you can't commit to a monthly support through Patreon, you can pay a one-off amount of your choice and you can hear that bonus episode. I will do that from time to time. But I do want to reassure everyone listening that the main Weird in the Wade episodes are and always will be free. And if you do want to support the show, one of the most effective ways of doing so is to either rate or review the podcast if you haven't already. It really does help other people find the show. I really appreciate all the support I get, and I wanted to say hi to all my new listeners from all over the world. Many of you have been contacting me recently, and it's so lovely to hear from you. And of course, I want to say hello to all my old regulars. Thank you so much for being part of Team Weird. Just to let you know, in case you didn't know this, I always give a shout out at the end of the episode to anyone who has supported the podcast in the last month. So do stick around to the end and hear your name if you have donated. Right, let's get back to Camden House School. The Crab Lane Ghost. The opening story was one that I imagined, but I did base it on the few facts that we have about the school and the Crab Lane haunting. In the early 1880s, and so most likely some years before, the school was run by the 3 Lockwood sisters and a cousin. They took in a few boarders, and one was Kate de Messi Kay. Interestingly, her father was a wine merchant with a shop and home on the market square in Biggleswade, so it seems odd that she is boarding at the school, which is just a 2-minute walk from her home. Also, the de Messi part of her name is a middle name, and she is the only person in her family at the time with such an unusual moniker. In the 1881 census, there is also a maid named Louisa Green and one called Priscilla living at the school along with a cook. But whether any of them saw the Crab Lane apparition, we will never know. What I do know is that during the 1880s, the Crab Lane Gardens were so well known to be haunted that people who lived along Cemetery Street, now the Bulk, were afraid to walk past them after dark. The school children who attended Camden House School were aware of the ghost story as well, with many afraid to travel along Crab Lane alone. It caused a real headache for the school teachers and parents of the children. A glowing white ghost was so infamous that in 1885, a local lad named Sam decided to don a white sheet and pretend to be the Crab Lane ghost as a prank. This led to a sudden increase in ghost sightings, and a group of local men got together and decided to, quote, lay the ghost once and for all. And like an episode of Scooby-Doo, the men lay in wait in the bushes of the Crab Lane garden and seized hold of Sam. The white sheet was pulled from Sam's head in a public unmasking. This story became so entrenched in the town's memory, it was being repeated in the local newspaper at regular intervals up until the 1960s. I remember attending an event at Biggleswade Library in the early 80s where ghost stories were shared, including that Crab Lane was haunted by a headless horseman, though that, as we have seen, is not how this haunting story began. It seems early on it was just a white glowing thing that was seen in the gardens, which is why Sam's white sheet trick worked. It sounds more like a will-o'-the-wisp to me, but maybe I'm being influenced by the fact that there is now a fairy glen outside the library under those very chestnut trees. When one of the chestnut trees became diseased and was chopped down, the library made a fairy tree stump, adding decorations, fae folk figurines, and even better, in the autumn, actual fungi creates stages for the fairies to rest on. Photos of this delightful display are on the blog at weirdinthewade.blog. But that's not the only reason why my mind turns to fairies and helpful spirits and sprites. I have been told by someone who works in the vicinity that some mysterious but helpful things have been happening to her and her colleagues. Items are being tidied up on their own accord, for example. I hope to bring you more on that story in the next episode. An education. It seems Camden House School itself, and not just its immediate environs, were rumoured to be haunted, and it's not hard to imagine why. Think back to your own school days. I bet you knew a ghost story connected with your school, right? I asked on Twitter recently if anyone remembered any ghost stories relating to their schools, and just about everyone seems to remember some vague notion of the stage or the toilets or the changing rooms being haunted. I was told a tale of a mining accident leading to a haunting in one school. In others, it was former headmasters and teachers whose souls could not leave the establishment. In another, it was a box-headed dog who haunted a dormitory. Yet another education establishment recorded incidents staff experienced in a dedicated book. It's clear that I need to do a Weird Wonder episode just about school hauntings. One of the schools I attended was said to be haunted by a World War II airman. Because schools are scary places, especially when empty of the bustle of the school day. As a former teacher, I know just how eerie it is to stand in a space, usually raucous with activity, and yet for it to be so silent, you can hear your own heart beating. I also think it's interesting that these hauntings are often associated with places of stress for children within the school, like the toilets, for example, one of the few places where teachers are not routinely present. All sorts of things happen in school toilets: bullying, tearful confessions, lonely kids hiding in them, and they're often dark and gloomy spaces. Similarly, changing rooms are places of anxiety and fear for many children, and so is the stage or school hall, where performances of all kinds happen and the nerves associated with them seem to resonate in the air. I am sure Camden House was no different. A history lesson at Camden House School. What Camden House was before it was a school is unclear. The building, I would estimate, is at least 200 years old. Like most town centre Biggleswade buildings, it is likely to have been built or at least redeveloped after the fire in 1785. I've looked at census records, but prior to 1881, it is not a school, and it is hard to pin down exactly who is living there. The numbering of Stratton Street that it's on seems to change with every decade, and Camden House, as its name is, only appears when the school does. There's also no constant family at that end of the street to help anchor it, unlike on the high street with the constant Spongs and their chemist shop. They ran that chemist's near to the Crown Hotel for almost 200 years. Camden House School was run by a succession of sisters. There were the Lockwoods in the 1880s, then the Millers, and then the Satchells stepped in during the early 1900s. But it wasn't long until a rival school, based on the bulk, in what would become the doctor's surgery, took over Camden House School. And these sisters were the Birds, led by Elizabeth and Lottie Bird. There were also 3 other sisters in tow. In the late 19th and early 20th century, education was being revolutionised across Britain. What had once been the privilege of the upper classes was now opening up to the middle and finally working class children. Fears for the welfare of children, and in an attempt to end child labour, compulsory education of children between the ages of 5 and 10 was introduced in 1880, though a decade later only around 82% of eligible children were complying. For girls, this number was even lower, and their attendance was more sporadic. For working families needing help in the home or with home industries, girls were taken out of school as and when they were needed, whilst boys' education was at least seen as more important. And it wasn't until 1893 and 1899 that blind and deaf children and then other disabled children were provided with an education, although this was segregated away in special schools, and certainly didn't resemble the same education that non-disabled children were receiving. But it was a boom period for schools being set up across the country. Although most, but the poorest parents paid fees for their children's education, there was a growing need for schools that catered for the lower middle classes. It appears that Camden House School was initially one of these establishments. The women running the school were well educated, unmarried and decidedly middle class. The Millers and Satchells advertised that they have been trained at reputable colleges including Cambridge, and for women of this background, running a school was a viable alternative to marriage. Being a schoolmistress in a fee-paying school like Camden House was a respectable job and a position of authority that most women were denied. This becomes clear when you read the articles and advertisements run in the local newspapers about Camden House School. The school specialised in teaching girls music, languages, art and literature. There is always a young French schoolmistress based in the school teaching French. Regular concerts are held in Biggleswade and the surrounding area, featuring the school teachers and the pupils playing classical music and more modern, respectable theatrical and music hall numbers. The school regularly announces the achievements of its pupils in music, art and language exams. There are frequent charitable teas, garden parties, concerts and performances to raise money for local nurses and other suitable charitable organisations. By 1905, a new schoolroom has been added along Crab Lane, most probably the single-storey Labour Hall which stands behind Camden House today. The schoolroom would open up education to boys and more day students. By the 1920s, there will be tales of how the school is haunted by a young schoolteacher who died of a broken heart after an ill-fated love affair. I could find no suspicious deaths or deaths of any young women linked to Camden House School. But I did discover that in 1911, Miss Elizabeth Ann Bird, headmistress of Camden House School, passed away of what was described as heart trouble. She was, however, in her mid-50s and had been ailing for a year, but it was clear that the town mourned her greatly. The Biggleswade Chronicle devotes a lot of space to her funeral, including recording all the floral tributes and messages sent down to Southampton where she was buried. In fact, her predecessor, Miss Satchell, also died of heart trouble, aged 58. Maybe these deaths by heart trouble got mixed up as a broken heart by later storytellers. Exactly 10 years later, in 1921, Elizabeth Bird's sister Lottie, who took over as headmistress, died suddenly and completely unexpectedly. She was also by this time not a young woman and left behind 3 further sisters at the school. The impact these women had on the town cannot be underestimated. I found obituaries of former pupils in the 1930s onwards which mention the difference that the Miss Birds had on their lives, particularly in teaching children music. There is one heartbreaking obituary from 1931 of a young man named Frederick who was taught music by Miss Bird and developed not just a love of music for life but also of instrument making. He made tin whistles and pipes and taught himself to play various musical styles after his initial education with Miss Bird. Then the First World War happened, and this boisterous and sociable young man joined the Navy, testing the very fastest warships and seeing action in at least one major naval battle. Frederick returned to Biggleswade a changed man, withdrawn, uncommunicative, and he sought solace in the music he loved so much. But sadly, that was not enough to sustain him, and in 1931 he took his own life on Boxing Day. His long and beautifully written obituary mentions prominently the influence Miss Bird and Camden House School had on Frederick, whose life was so tragically cut short. I am not exactly sure when Camden House School closed, but a wonderful and strange article written by a former paperboy in Biggleswade during the war fills in the picture for us. The rather disjointed and badly formatted article appears in the Comet newspaper archive and does not state who wrote the article, but this is what they said back in 2006.
Mrs. Dutton of West Norwood took over the school for a short period, and indications were that the school would continue, but Camden House was sold to Parker Herbert early in 1922. Parker Herbert was a business as a newsagent and a stationer. He produced a series of pictorial postcards that are much sought after today. He also sold toys, Meccano and Hornby trains. I went to work for him in June 1940 as a paperboy. During the London Blitz, daily newspapers always came out, but they arrived late and we delivered them during the school dinner hour. Soon afterwards, Mr. and Mrs. Binder took over, and I continued as their paperboy, collecting newspapers from the early train a short distance away, as well as delivering to London Road. Mr. and Mrs. Binder expanded the business, taking over Larkinson's Market Square shop in 1943, also opening a bookshop on the Market House in 1945. They retired in 1948, selling both newsagents' shops to Horace Marshall and Son Limited. The High Street shop has changed hands many times. It was Chopsticks in 1957, and it is now Sunflower Takeaway.
And it's in the late 1950s and early 1960s that we take up the story of Camden House again. The Ghost Shop. By 1964, Camden House had been home to a newsagent's for over 40 years, just as long as it had been a school. The schoolroom behind it was now the Labour Hall. Camden House itself is a large white building with a small cottage attached to it, which was known as Camden Cottage and was part of the school building back in the 19th century. By the 1960s, it was 3 separate businesses, including the Chinese takeaway and the newsagents. The newsagent and stationers was called Wyman's, and the manager was a gentleman called Mr. Boniface. We know this because Mr. Boniface and some of his colleagues spoke with local newspapers about some peculiar and unsettling incidents that had been occurring in the shop and above whilst renovations were taking place. The Haunting of Camden House. It started out rather innocuously, as hauntings often do. Painters and decorators who were in the building carrying out work for Mr. Boniface reported hearing strange moans and groans coming from empty rooms that they were yet to work in. Naturally, they thought it could be several things. Maybe a radio playing, one of their mates messing around, even just the old building settling. But none of these explanations ever added up. All the lads working there experienced it, and none owned up to playing a prank. Mr. Boniface even admitted to hearing the moans and groans himself when he was in the shop,
by himself and before the painting and decorating had begun, but the noises increased in frequency once the work had started. If the sound of ghostly groaning was not enough, one afternoon a young painter and decorator, let's call him Derek, was up a ladder. Derek was painting away when he heard footsteps running up behind him. Turning, thinking it was his mate after something, he was shocked to see no one there. The footsteps had been clear and definitely stopped just behind him. There was no time for anyone to scuttle away. He'd turned immediately to see what they wanted. To say Derek was shaken by this was an understatement. Another worker, let's call him Howard, was busy in one of the upstairs rooms, right by the attic stairs. The attics were not used at the time and lay empty. The door at the bottom of the stairs leading up to the attic was securely closed. It was a heavy door and rarely used. Howard was getting on with his work when he heard footsteps clattering down the stairs. This surprised him. He hadn't even realised that anyone was up there. He turned to see the heavy door swing wide open, but no one came through, and the clattering footsteps had stopped at the door. It was as if an unseen person had run down the stairs, flinging the door open to get out from up there. All of this unsettled the staff, and it led to a newspaper reporter being told of the tales. He visited Camden House and explored the upstairs attics, which he described as having an eerie atmosphere. The local reporter dug around for more information about the building and the haunting, and he was then told a tale he described as more strange than anything he'd heard so far. It is the late 1950s, and Camden House has a Chinese takeaway operating out of it, and Wyman's newsagents, but it's before Mr. Boniface's time. I do not know the manager's name, nor his wife's, but let's call them Bill and Ivy. They live in Camden House in a flat above the newsagents. The road outside their house is still the Great North Road. The A1 bypass of Biggleswade is yet to be completed. There are still many old pubs and coaching inns open in Biggleswade. In many ways, Biggleswade has more in common with the time of Camden House School under the Miss Birds than it does with the Biggleswade of today. Bill and Ivy like living above the shop. Although the building is old and creaky, it is their home. Our strange tale happens at night. Ivy is asleep in bed until she isn't. She wakes suddenly, bleary, a little confused as to what has woken her, but she sees that Bill has got up. He is standing at the end of the bed. It's obvious that it was him who woke her. And her next thought is, what on earth is Bill up to, getting up at this time of night? She yawns and she groggily asks, "Bill, what are you up to, love?" Then the temperature in the room plummets. Her heart feels like it's stopped, only to kick-start up again and race into her throat, because she hears Bill at her side stir after she speaks. The person standing at the end of the bed is not Bill. She is wide awake now. The blood in her veins feels like ice. She cannot tear her eyes away from the figure at the foot of her bed. Her first panicked thought is that it is a burglar, but there is enough street light filtering through their bedroom window for Ivy to see that the figure is not quite right. It's not quite solid. It is motionless and shadowy, darker than the dark around it, but it is also flat. It's like an outline on a blackboard, chalky around the edges, but it feels very much like it's staring at her, like it can see her just as she can see it. And whatever it is full of dread. She grabs her husband's arm, digging her fingers into Bill's flesh.
"Bill, wake Bill,
she hisses. And as her words escape, the shadow figure at the end of the bed seems to dissolve, like it's being rubbed out. There is a smudge of what looks like chalk dust, and then it is gone. By the time Bill is awake, there is nothing for him to see at the end of the bed. We don't know what happened to Ivy and Bill, but they're clearly not living in Camden House a few years later when Mr. Boniface is in charge. The news reporter's interest is piqued, and he begins to dig even deeper into the history of the building, the school in particular. Some in the town say that the old school is haunted by a former pupil or young schoolmistress who died of a broken heart. But the reporter also unearths mention of the Crab Lane ghost from the 1880s who haunted the garden path where the ambulance depot now stands. He wonders if this is linked to the Camden House haunting, but no conclusions are drawn and the story seems to rest again until Friday, the 13th of March, 1970. On that day, the Biggleswade Chronicle ran an article with the headline, "Ghost Shop Closes." It reports that the small newsagents, formerly Wyman's, had become a John Menzies. There was a much larger John Menzies on the market square next to the Woolworths, but this smaller shop, which at this point had been a newsagent of some description for 48 years, was going to be shut by John Menzies. The decision, it says, was made at John Menzies' Edinburgh headquarters. The newspaper article goes on to explain that the shop was supposed to have had a ghost and that in its basement it has an entrance to a tunnel which is rumoured to lead all the way to the church. The tunnels. I was surprised when I read about the tunnels stretching as far as Camden House. I had no idea that the tunnels in Biggleswade reached that far east. So back in March, I met with a lovely lady named Beverly who has researched Biggleswade's mysterious tunnels to quite extraordinary lengths. I met Beverly at the surfing cafe on the market square on a mild early spring day. Beverly was wearing a gorgeous patchwork and embroidered coat. She works in hospitality, including previously at Biggleswade's Conservative Club, and had that practical, confident air that you need when running a bar or pub. She had also drawn me a map. Beverly started her research with her children as a school project, but it had grown into something bigger. Her children eventually lost interest, but Beverly kept going. She researched online, at the library, and in person at many Biggleswade properties. She was let into many of the cellars and took photographs to show where doorways have been blocked up and bricked up. Two things really struck me about Beverly's work, above and beyond how dedicated she is to it, and that is the map of where the tunnels are beneath Biggleswade and the businesses and homes they emerge under could be a map showing something else altogether. And one of the creepiest photographs that Beverly had is one from the cellar underneath Camden House. The map. As I looked at the map, and again I have shared an image of this map on the blog, I realised that a lot of the properties marked on it had something else in common, not just tunnel entrances, corresponded with ghost sightings or paranormal reports. There are two town centre based ghost stories that I am aware of which do not link to the tunnels, and that's the Telephone Exchange on Hitchin Street and the Sea Cadet Hall on Station Road. But the following locations all have ghost stories attached as well as tunnel entrances beneath them. We have Camden House, the Golden Pheasant, the Crown, the old Woolworths and Boots, which were once the Catherine Wheel pub, the Conservative Club, the Haunted Pound Stretcher and the shop next door, the old Coach and Horses pub, and Millennium House towards the north end of Shortmead Street. Now,
There are some logical reasons for why this might be. The older a building, the more likely it was to have a basement. Also, the more likely it is to have a tunnel entrance. The older a building, the more likely it is to have a ghost story attached to it. But I still found it rather intriguing. And what of that photograph of the bricked-up tunnel entrance beneath Camden House? The business who let Beverly into the basement to take the picture are no longer based there, so I don't know what it looks like now. I've shared the photograph on the show blog at weirdintheway.blog so you can see it. There is clearly a bricked up small doorway, but then in front of that doorway is a brick arch, and in front of that arch is a window. It's a window that has been fitted, and it's utterly bizarre. Why a window would be fitted in front of a bricked up doorway, I do not know, and the window looks fairly modern. This isn't more than a few decades old. There's only a matter of inches between the doorway and the window. Have a look for yourself, and I'd love to know if you have any theories about why there is a window there. Maybe I'm missing something. You'll also find images of the tunnel map with the haunting locations marked on them on the blog as well, and that is weirdinthewade.blog. And that's where I thought we'd end today's episode. In fact, I recorded my narration, edited it, and was ready to add sound effects and music, but something just didn't feel right. It wasn't the tunnel side of things. That's all coming up in the next episode. It was Camden House School. You see, if there's one thing that making Weird in the Wade has taught me, it's that however thin a rumour might seem, there is usually some truth to it. And the rumour from about 1920 onwards was that Camden House was haunted by the ghost of a young schoolmistress. You see, Miss Satchel and the Miss Birds, their deaths were clearly a shock, an upset to the town of Biggleswade, but they were all middle-aged when they died. There had to be something else, surely. So I went back to researching, and at 11 o'clock last night, 3 days before this episode is set to be released, I stumbled across a story that might just fill in those gaps. Annie Bryant. Annie Bryant was born in 1895 in Bridgewater, Somerset, a market town considerably larger than Biggleswade, but with some similarities, both being important towns for transport. Annie's father, Howell George Bryant, owned a coal merchant's, but was far more famous for playing rugby for Somerset's First 15 and for the Bridgewater Dreadnoughts. Annie grew up in a respectable middle-class family with a couple of servants to assist her mother Nancy in the running of the household. The 1911 census records show that Annie, who was 16, was a student at St Margaret's School for Girls in Burnham-on-Sea. There is a fabulous web page dedicated to the school on a Burnham-on-Sea history website. It includes a school photo from 1910, which surely Annie is featured on somewhere. I will, as always, post links to this page on our show blog, weirdinthewade.blog. I wonder which of the girls Annie is. The school is definitely grander than Camden House in Biggleswade, but the images of the school of St Margaret's, and in particular its hallway with its dinner gong, as well as the schoolroom, all shown on the website, will give you a good idea of what Camden House School was like, just on a smaller scale. Annie must have done well at school, because by the time she's 19, she is working at Camden House School in Biggleswade as a third form schoolmistress. School forms were the groupings of children by age. A form was the original bench that they would have sat on hundreds of years before. We still talk about sixth form in England for years 12 and 13. Even when I was at school in the 80s, one of the schools I attended called years forms, and it wasn't a posh school either, it was just old.
We might think nowadays of third form being year 9 or teaching 13 and 14-year-olds, but back in the 1910s, compulsory schooling only went up to age 12. So I think third form children would have been aged 8 and 9, a nice age group for teaching. We don't know much more about what Annie got up to in Biggleswade other than working at the school, but we do know that there was a talk given in February 1915 at Biggleswade's Methodist Chapel that she most likely attended, as the school teachers of Camden House School were present. The talk was by a soldier and focused on encouraging temperance in the British forces fighting at the time in World War I. It must have been a worrying and stressful time for Annie, who most likely arrived at Camden House School as a teacher aged 18 in 1913 on the eve of the Great War. The news article about the talk given by the soldier promoting temperance says that many soldiers and military personnel were being put up in Biggleswade homes at the time. I wonder if these two things are linked. Keep the soldiers staying with you off the drink, people of Biggleswade. Annie was most likely living at Camden House, as most young schoolmistresses did. It must have also been an exciting time for her to be away from home, starting an independent life as a school teacher. I remember how I felt 80 years later when I first started teaching. But the reason I am telling you Annie's story is because in the July of 1915, just 5 months after attending that temperance talk at the Methodist Chapel in Biggleswade, Annie Bryant suddenly died. Local newspapers cover the death as deeply saddening all of the Camden House School. They say Annie was a much-loved third-form school teacher, but they do say she had bouts of anemia and neuralgia, but was taken seriously ill suddenly and died in Bedford's County Hospital on a Sunday. She was buried in Bedford. There are a few things that strike me about Annie's death. Firstly, that she is buried in Bedford. There is no mention of who attended her funeral or the tributes paid, and many other funerals written up in the newspapers receive this kind of attention. Also, that she has not returned home for burial in Burnham-on-Sea, where her family then lived, and remained for the next 25 years. There is no death notice in the newspapers of Somerset that I can find. Now, this might be down to protocol during the war. With so many young men dying in France, maybe ordinary or non-war related deaths were being sidelined. Maybe transporting her body back to Somerset was seen as too much expense during the war. But other death notices and notices of funerals are far more lavish in detail than that of poor Annie's. It does read as if no one apart from the school really cared or even wanted to acknowledge her death. Her cause of death, anemia and neuralgia, could mean many things. Neuralgia at the time was used to describe nerve pain as we use that term today, but it could also be used to describe headaches or undiagnosed pain. In the late 19th century, it was often used to describe what male physicians deemed the mysterious pains women suffered, often putting the pain down to an overstimulated mind, or basically saying it was all in their female patients' heads. One doctor even wrote that too much education could bring on neuralgia in women. I'm sure the teachers at Camden House School had no truck with such beliefs, and these theories were on the wane during the 1910s, though we still live with the consequences of such beliefs today, with women's pain, especially in relation to conditions like endometriosis and the like, often not taken seriously or underestimated and understudied by the medical profession. I don't think we'll ever know what poor young Annie died from, but we do know that it saddened her students and colleagues at the school. So I wonder if it was Annie's death which inspired those ghost stories. Hers is the only young woman's death I have found in connection with the school, and it took a lot of digging. She is in many ways the perfect candidate for a ghost story to grow up around. She is an outsider to the town. There are no relatives to offend when children tell stories of their old schoolmistress whose spirit still wanders the schoolroom and the attics of Camden House. She was young, no doubt pretty, and if she was a sufferer of anemia, maybe she already had that pale, wan and sylph-like appearance, like a ghost. And maybe she did have a beau. Maybe he was away at war or about to go to France. Maybe he died in the trenches or called off their tryst before he left. But maybe that was a story that just fitted better when the tales began to spread of the death of a young schoolmistress. So maybe, just maybe, Annie is the ghost who haunts Camden House, taken too young, a woman whose whole life was unfurling in front of her like a blossoming rose, only to be snipped short unfairly. Maybe her spirit still wanders Camden House. Or maybe she just inspired a tale of ghostly goings-on. Either way, I'm glad I've been able to share her story 109 years after her death. I also discovered another earlier headmistress for Camden House School whilst researching last night. In the late 1870s, the school was run by a Miss Fisher, and unusually spelt too as Fischer, but little other than her name I can find out. There is a large Fisher clan, spelt the more conventional way, living in Biggleswade, who were of the right class for maybe to have a daughter who would set up a school, but I have not found an actual link to that family yet. Camden House might be the most easterly extent of the Biggleswade tunnels, and I might not understand fully why it has a tunnel entrance at all, but it's certainly a building and surrounding area with a collection of ghost stories attached to it. But I promised you answers to the mysteries of the tunnels, and for that, you'll have to wait until next time. Next time on Weird in the Wade, I reveal why I believe the tunnels were built and who built them. I've also uncovered another ghost story linked to the tunnels, this time occurring at the Conservative Club many years ago. The ghost story not only takes place in a building which has a tunnel entrance, but also might explain an even older origin for some of the tunnels in Biggleswade. I also plan to descend into at least one of the basements to record my impressions of them, and if I'm lucky, one of those basements will be at the former haunted pound stretcher. Thank you so much for listening today. I realised that I forgot to tell you what Camden House is today. I did mention that the old schoolroom is the Labour Hall, and I've been in the Labour Hall by myself on a few occasions, including at night, as I used to organise quite a few events there. It is one of those spaces that does feel oddly quiet when you're alone. I always put it down to the fact that it's a building often full of debate and discussion, but I now wonder if the walls still remember it once being full of children learning, and so the quiet, when it is empty, is thicker because of it. But Camden House itself still stands on the corner of the High Street, or Stratton Street as it was, and Crab Lane. The following businesses are now housed in the building: Loveday's Opticians, Domino's Pizza, and the Burger Shack. I do remember Sunflower Takeaway being there, and a baker's and sweet shop. I believe it was still a newsagent when I was a child, and I probably bought sweets and comics from there. The photograph of the tunnel that is on the blog is from when the wonderful Skips florists operated out of that building. I recently did some research for Skips, who are now situated opposite the Market Square on the High Street, and Skips have been in the town selling flowers since at least 1903, though back then they also sold sweets and confectionery. I am very much looking forward to making the next episode all about the tunnels. For those of you who are on the Patreon, June's Patreon episode is about Peg Nut Wood. a piece of woodland linking the ancient village of Sutton to Potton, just to the northeast of Biggleswade. The wood has a peculiar bridge, which dogs, children, and many adults, including me, do not like to cross. I have visited twice to record audio, video, and take photos there. I also spoke with local author Paul Jameson about his impressions and experiences of the place. Is there a natural explanation to our fears of that place? Or is there a ghostly explanation? Or is it something altogether different? A time slip? Or a thin place where the fae folk are active? So do sign up to the Patreon if you'd like to hear that content. I would like to say a huge thank you to the following people for joining Team Weird on Patreon already. Thank you so much, Claire Kendall, Michelle Birkby, Ian Peacock, Sally and John Hawkes. Thank you for joining Team Weird. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Kelfe, Anna Zapata, I hope I got that right, Leslie and Tamsin Wolf for your support on Ko-fi. Remember, if you donate on Ko-fi, you get access to that first Patreon episode, so you can get a taste for what gets released on Patreon. Also, thank you so much to everyone who has bought merch from the Weird in the Wade shop. We have 2 new items in the shop this month, a beautiful notebook and a drawstring bag, which, as always, might be haunted. The mugs are proving very popular as well, as are the t-shirts now that the weather in the UK is getting warmer. And just a reminder that the money I raise for the podcast goes back into the show and keeping it free from adverts. This month, I've paid my annual subscription to Epidemic Sounds, which provide the majority of the music and sound effects for the show. I've also paid for the blog hosting and the podcast hosting site on Podbean, and my subscription to the old newspapers archive I use for a lot of my research. May is a costly month for the show, so all your donations really, really help and they keep the show going. So thank you. And don't worry if you can't donate. I know times are tough at the moment. So you can support Weird in the Wade by telling others about the show, sharing on social media, and rating and reviewing the show where you listen if you haven't already. Thank you so much for listening, all of you. It does really mean the world to me. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. Theme music is by Tess Savagir, and all additional music and sound effects are from Epidemic Sound.